I step into the shadows of history, where forgotten truths lie buried beneath the weight of time. What if the past you thought you knew was a lie? Welcome to Forgotten History Tales. Join me as we uncover the untold stories that have shaped our world. The gavel strikes again, its reverberations still echoing in the cavernous room, yet my thoughts remain suspended in the air. The trial proceeds, but I cannot help but feel that something is amiss. The speeches, the evidence, the testimonies, they are all part of the grand spectacle of justice. But beneath the surface, the true nature of this trial is more elusive than it appears. I find myself growing restless, my mind racing with questions that are left unanswered, feelings that cannot be quelled. It is as if the trial itself is the surface of a deep ocean, and the secrets I am searching for lie submerged, just out of reach. I glance at the faces of the accused, their expressions a mask of weariness and defiance. In the weeks that have followed, the tension has only grown thicker, as each new accusation layers itself upon the last, like a blanket suffocating the truth beneath. The prosecution has set its sights on the men in the dock, painting them as the architects of a regime that wreaked havoc across Europe. They are charged with crimes so vast, so unimaginable, that it seems impossible for any one person to have committed them. And yet, in this courtroom, the reality is undeniable. These men stand accused of the most heinous atrocities in human history. But the more I watch, the more I listen, the more I begin to see the trial for what it truly is: a performance, a delicate dance between the victors and the vanquished. The weight of the world's judgment is pressing down on these men, but in some twisted way, it feels as though the stage is set for something darker. I watch as the chief prosecutor, his voice as steady as a metronome, pauses to let the evidence sink in. The courtroom holds its breath, every eye fixed on the screen before them. The images flash: piles of bodies, concentration camps, the horror of the Holocaust laid bare. And yet, there is a silence that hangs in the air, the silence of a question that no one dares ask aloud. How did we get here? I feel it again, that unease, like a shadow creeping up my spine. The world has condemned these men for their crimes, and yet, in the grand scheme of things, what does justice truly mean in a world so broken? The people of Nuremberg, the people of the world, have all gathered here to witness this trial, to seek closure and answers. But no matter how many guilty verdicts are handed down, the true question lingers: what do we, as a collective, choose to forget? What do we choose to bury in the name of moving forward? The defense has its turn. The defendants, those once towering figures of the Nazi regime, now reduced to shadows of their former selves, respond with their own version of events. Their words, carefully measured and cold, drip with the arrogance of men who once believed they could shape the world according to their will. But now, in this sterile room, the world has turned its back on them. Yet, as I listen to their defense, I cannot shake the feeling that there is more to this story, something that remains hidden beneath the veneer of righteous indignation. One by one, the accused take their turn, their voices wavering between fear and defiance. They paint their actions as those of duty, of loyalty to their Führer, of following orders. But as their words fill the room, I am struck by a chilling realization. They are not the only ones who followed orders. The prosecution makes its case. A well-oiled machine, each piece working in unison to dismantle the legacy of the Third Reich. But beneath the surface, there is something else at play here, something that cannot be ignored. The very men who stand trial today, men who were complicit in the most horrific crimes the world has ever seen, are only one piece of the puzzle. What is missing? Who else stands in the shadows, pulling the strings, hiding their own dark secrets behind the guise of justice? I find myself drawn back to the images on the screen, the faces of those who perished in the camps, their eyes hollow, their bodies broken. I can almost hear their silent cries for justice, for the truth to be exposed. But as I stare at those faces, I am forced to confront another truth. The Nuremberg Trials, as monumental as they were, could not and would not answer all the questions. Justice, it seemed, was a currency in short supply, and the victors, too, were guilty of their own moral compromises. And so, as the days bleed into weeks, I feel the slow unraveling of something far more disturbing. The trial may have been a stage for justice, but in the shadows, darker things stirred. What of the scientists, the engineers, the industrialists who turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions? What of the quiet complicity of the rest of the world, who allowed the Nazi regime to rise in the first place? What of the countless others who walked away unscathed, their hands just as stained as the men in the dock? The room seems to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter as the weight of history settles heavily on my shoulders. I see now, with unsettling clarity, that Nuremberg is not just a trial of men. It is a trial of the very soul of humanity, a reckoning with the darkness that lies within us all. I take a step back from the courtroom, the sounds of the trial fading into the background as my mind continues to race. There are more secrets here than we have yet to uncover. The stories of the victims will never be forgotten, but the stories of the perpetrators, those who still walk in the shadows, remain to be told. And as I stand there, looking out across the courtroom, I hear a faint whisper in the distance, a promise of something yet to come. The real story of Nuremberg is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The trial carries on, day after day, as the weight of history presses down on those who seek to judge the accused. Yet, as I sit there, absorbed in the flood of testimonies, I cannot shake the unsettling feeling that something has been overlooked. The Nuremberg trials have exposed the brutality of the Nazi regime, the mind-bending atrocities committed in the name of ideology. But what of the other players, the ones whose names do not appear on the trial docket? What of the ones who aided and abetted the horrors from behind closed doors, hidden in plain sight? I take you deeper into the corridors of power, to the men and women whose names were deliberately omitted from the trial. For every Nazi official in the dock, there were countless others whose hands were just as bloodstained, yet they were allowed to walk free, their crimes left unpunished. It is in the quiet moments, between the grand speeches and the dramatic accusations, that the truth begins to surface, slowly, painfully, like blood seeping through cracks in the earth. The prosecutors, relentless in their pursuit of justice, focus on the prominent figures, the architects of the Reich's evil. But what about the soldiers who blindly followed orders, the scientists who conducted inhumane experiments, the industrial magnates who profited from the blood of their fellow human beings? What of the silent complicit parties who saw their neighbors suffering and chose to look away? I can feel the tension in the courtroom shift as the defense team presents its case. Their argument is simple, almost maddening in its simplicity. The accused were merely following orders, soldiers doing their duty, bureaucrats carrying out state policy. It's a defense that rests not on the idea of moral integrity, but on the lie of obedience. But as the defense lays its arguments bare, I feel a flicker of doubt. Is there some truth to it? Did the machine that was Nazi Germany operate with such precision that every individual, no matter their role, was merely a cog in the wheel, incapable of resisting the powerful forces at play? I look at the defendants now, their faces set in a hard, calculating expression. Some of them, men like Göring and Hess, appear unbroken, defiant, while others are shadows of their former selves, defeated by the weight of their guilt and the realization of their impending doom. Their eyes dart between the prosecutor, their defense, and the eyes of the world watching them. And yet, I know that even in their defeat, they carry with them a deeper truth, a secret that cannot be spoken aloud. What if their complicity was not the exception, but the rule? The question haunts me. As I sit there, I realize that the story of the Nazis cannot be reduced to the actions of a few prominent figures. No, the story of the Third Reich is a story of a collective madness, a society that allowed itself to be consumed by hate and ideology. But that same ideology did not disappear overnight with the collapse of the regime. It bled into the very fabric of the post-war world, where it would be quietly tucked away, covered up by those who feared what it might mean if the full extent of the truth were to emerge. The trial continues, but the atmosphere has shifted. There is something darker hanging in the air now. I feel it in the way the prosecutors speak, in the way the defendants react. There is a subtle shift in the room, a sense that everyone is aware of the elephant in the courtroom, the vast, untold truth that lies just beyond the reach of the law. This trial, this grand spectacle of justice, is but one chapter in a much larger story, a story of complicity, of collaboration, of silence. I take you now into the darkest corners of Nuremberg, to the places where the real secrets lie hidden. For it is here, in these shadowed spaces, that the true scope of the Nazi regime's horrors can be understood. These are the stories that no one talks about, the ones that have been buried, swept under the rug in the rush to rebuild a broken world. One of the most insidious aspects of the regime's success was the way it infiltrated every facet of society, weaving its poisonous ideology into the very fabric of the culture. It didn't take much to find willing participants. From the highest echelons of power to the smallest town hall, the Reich found its followers. There were those who joined willingly, driven by hatred, ambition, or sheer ignorance. Then there were those who were coerced, manipulated by the state into doing its bidding, yet unable to see the full extent of the evil they were enabling. And so the question lingers, where did it end? I sit there in the courtroom, my mind racing, and I realize that what Nuremberg has become is not just a trial of individuals. It is the first step toward a far more complicated reckoning, a confrontation with the moral rot that had taken root in the very heart of Europe. What we are witnessing is not just the judgment of the guilty, but the judgment of a generation. This trial, these testimonies, this search for justice, it is all part of a larger narrative, and the true nature of that narrative is only beginning to reveal itself. As I look around the courtroom, I see the ghosts of the past reflected in the faces of the accused and the victims alike. I hear their whispers, faint but persistent, asking for answers that will never come. The trial may soon come to a close, but the darkness that Nuremberg has uncovered will not fade away. It will linger in the air, haunting the world long after the gavel falls. What did we choose to forget in the wake of war? What truths were buried, sacrificed in the name of rebuilding? The real story of Nuremberg is still out there, hidden in the dark corners of history, waiting for someone to finally uncover it. And as the final witnesses take the stand, I know that the answers are not yet here, but they will come soon enough. The gavel falls once more, but this time there is a shift in the atmosphere. The tension that once hung so thick in the courtroom is beginning to unravel. The end of the trial looms, the inevitable verdicts creeping closer with each passing day. The defenders have made their case, and the prosecution has presented the horror of the Nazi regime in all its grotesque clarity. Yet, as I sit there, I am struck by a deeper realization, a realization that gnaws at me, demanding my attention. This trial was never going to deliver the full truth. The weight of history is often uneven, and no matter how hard we try, there are some truths that are simply too dangerous to unearth. The trial was always going to be a facade, a way for the world to move forward, to patch over the gaping wounds left by the war. But in doing so, it obscures something far more sinister, something the victors would prefer to keep buried. And it is here, in this moment of reflection, that I begin to see the deeper story of Nuremberg, a story not of punishment, but of power, control, and the silencing of inconvenient truths. I take you back to the heart of the trial, where the true architects of the Nazi regime are being dissected piece by piece. The generals, the diplomats, the scientists, each one is being held up for public judgment. And yet, as I observe them, I feel an unsettling realization forming at the edge of my consciousness. These men, for all their guilt, are merely the visible symptom of a much larger disease. What of the men who never made it to the dock? What of the powerful industrialists who fueled the war machine, the doctors who conducted their inhumane experiments, the officers who turned a blind eye to the suffering of the millions who were deported to their deaths? They remain unscathed, untouched by the hand of justice. I hear the prosecutor's voice, powerful and unyielding as it cuts through the air, accusing one of the defendants of ordering the deaths of thousands. The weight of his words hits me like a physical blow. But as the courtroom listens, rapt, I can't help but wonder, what if the true scale of the devastation cannot be understood by simply looking at the faces of those who ordered the atrocities? What if we are missing the larger web of complicity, the forces behind the curtain who made it all possible? The faces of the accused stand before me, their expressions unreadable. Some look resigned, others defiant, but all share the same understanding. This trial, despite its gravity, will never fully pierce the heart of the system that gave birth to their crimes. These men, these Nazis, are the monsters we can see, but there are others, unseen, whose hands were just as bloodstained. Men in power, men in the shadows, pulling strings, creating policy, and profiting from the war. Where are they now? The trial was always going to be about more than just the guilt of these men. It was about the world's need for closure, a need to move forward, to rebuild. But the deeper truth, the one that gnaws at the edges of the courtroom, is that the real powers behind the Nazi machine have been allowed to slip through the cracks. Their names were never mentioned, their actions never discussed. And as the trial draws closer to its conclusion, I realize that what we are witnessing is not the end, but the beginning of an even darker chapter in history. As the final verdicts are read, there is a sense of finality in the air. Justice, it seems, has been served. But beneath the surface, I feel something else, something far more unsettling. The judgment of the accused is not the full reckoning. It is simply the world's attempt to close the door on a past that it is unwilling to confront in its entirety. The Nuremberg Trials, while important, will never offer the answers we seek. Not because the truth isn't there, but because the truth is too dangerous to unearth. I step out of the courtroom, the echoes of the trial still ringing in my ears. The streets of Nuremberg are quieter now, as though the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for something that has not yet come. The world will look at the trial and claim justice has been done. The accused will be punished, and the world will attempt to move on. But I know that the real story, the full story, is far darker than we could ever imagine. Behind every powerful man who fell at Nuremberg, there are the ones who never had to answer for their part in the destruction. They are the untold story, the shadow figures who will never be brought to trial, whose names will never appear in the history books. The Nazis may have been defeated, but the networks of power, the systems of influence, the corporations that fed off the war, they remain. I take you now into the silence that follows the trials, into the forgotten corners of history where these truths fester. Because even as we try to wash away the blood of the past, the stains remain. Some stories are left untold, not because they cannot be heard, but because the world is not ready to face them. And as I stand here, in the heart of Nuremberg, I realize that this trial may have ended, but the real reckoning is only just beginning. What will we uncover next? What truths will we dare to expose in the face of a history so dark it threatens to consume us all? The weight of Nuremberg lingers in the air long after the trial ends and the final judgments have been made. The world, in its rush to rebuild, wants to believe that justice has been served. But as the final gavel falls and the men in the dock are led away, a different truth begins to emerge. It is a truth that rises from the shadows, creeping quietly into the corners of history where the official records cannot reach. The trial may have ended, but the real consequences, the true impact of what was uncovered in that courtroom, are just beginning to unfold. I take you now to a world that is trying to forget, trying to move on, but unable to shake the lingering effects of what was revealed at Nuremberg. The trial, despite its noble aims, was never going to be enough. How could it be? The Nazi regime was not just a collection of men, but a vast, sprawling network of power, one that stretched into every corner of Europe and beyond. And this network, as much as it has been dismantled, is not as easily erased as history would like to believe. I walk the streets of post-war Germany, the ruins of the Reich still fresh in the minds of the people. There are those who speak in hushed tones, unwilling to acknowledge the true depth of what has been revealed. And then there are those who speak of it openly, as if they are trying to unburden themselves of a guilt that will never be fully theirs to bear. The survivors, those who lived through the horror, are left to pick up the pieces. But even they cannot escape the specter of what was exposed at Nuremberg. For the truth, as it often does, has a way of returning, of haunting us when we least expect it. I hear the whispers of those who were not on trial, the scientists who collaborated with the Nazis, the industrialists who profited from the war, the diplomats who turned a blind eye to the suffering. These are the names that never made it into the courtroom, the figures who quietly slipped into the post-war world, their hands clean, their consciences clear. But as the years pass, more and more of them are exposed, dragged from the shadows where they have been hiding. And the more I learn, the more I realize that the real story of Nuremberg is not just about those who were punished, but about those who got away. The world has moved on, or at least it tries to, but the ghost of Nazi Germany still haunts the halls of power. The very systems that allowed the Nazis to rise to power did not simply disappear. They evolved, adapted, and in many cases, thrived. The machinery of oppression, the infrastructure of hate, is still there, lurking beneath the surface of the post-war order. The men and women who helped build that machinery may have been purged from the government, but their ideas and methods remain deeply embedded in the fabric of the world. I find myself thinking about the men who went to Nuremberg, the ones who stood trial, the ones who were convicted. What happened to them once the world turned its gaze away from Nuremberg? Some were executed, their lives taken in the name of justice, their names etched forever in the annals of history as symbols of the evil that once ruled the earth. Others were imprisoned, their bodies confined to cold, sterile cells, awaiting the end of their days. But some escaped, and their escape is the most chilling part of this story. For while the world watched Nuremberg, they failed to notice the quiet exodus, the flight of Nazi officials and sympathizers to lands far from the reach of justice. South America, with its open arms and growing political instability, became a haven for many of the war's architects. The so-called rat lines offered a lifeline to those who had been involved in the most horrific crimes in human history. They left behind the ruins of the Reich and fled to new lives in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, hidden in plain sight, their pasts erased by new identities and the silence of those who protected them. I take you now into the heart of this new world, into the places where the Nazis found refuge, and into the lives they built after the war. The streets of Buenos Aires, once a place of vibrant cultural exchange, now seem more like a quiet refuge for those who would rather forget. The men who had once been part of the Nazi machine now walk freely, their crimes forgotten by the world around them. In their new homes, they are treated like old soldiers, their roles in the Reich minimized or erased entirely. But the truth does not remain buried forever. Slowly, as the decades pass, the world begins to piece together the puzzle. The truth leaks out, first in whispers, then in headlines, as the stories of Nazi escapees are brought to light. The names of the men who once wielded unimaginable power and influence are dragged into the open once again. But even as they are exposed, I feel the shadow of their influence lingering. The world may know what they did, but the systems they left behind are still in place, still functioning, still shaping the political landscape of the 20th century. I take you deeper now into the legacy of the Third Reich, into the far-reaching consequences of what was set in motion by the Nazi regime. The trial may have been the first step, but the reckoning, the true reckoning, has yet to come. The powers that supported the Nazis, the institutions that enabled their rise, have not been fully dismantled. They have simply been allowed to evolve. And as I stand here, in the ruins of post-war Europe, I realize that the ghosts of Nuremberg are still with us, watching, waiting, their influence still rippling through the world. The trial was supposed to be the end of something, a final judgment on the crimes of the Nazi regime. But as we look back, as we study the aftershocks of Nuremberg, we see that it was only the beginning of a much darker journey. A journey that continues to unfold, one that will take us deep into the heart of the post-war world, where the shadows of the past refuse to fade and the truth remains hidden beneath the surface. The gavel may have fallen, but the real work is far from over. The years have passed since the Nuremberg Trials, but the world remains a place of uneasy silence. The rubble of the Nazi regime has been cleared, the accused have been judged, and justice, in the eyes of many, has been served. Yet, as I continue to explore the aftermath of this historic moment, I find myself drawn deeper into the murky waters of history, where the surface of what we know only skims the truth, leaving dark currents beneath, unexamined and dangerous. Nuremberg was meant to be the great reckoning, the place where the crimes of the Nazi regime would be laid bare, where justice would be meted out in full. The victors, it seemed, had achieved a moral victory, ensuring that those responsible for the unimaginable atrocities of the war would face the consequences of their actions. But as the years have gone on, it becomes increasingly clear that Nuremberg did not uncover everything. No, some truths were deliberately left behind, buried too deeply to be touched by the light of justice. As I stand in the ruins of post-war Europe, I feel the weight of those unsaid words, the stories left untold. The trial was meant to focus on the individuals, the men who gave the orders, who organized the death camps, who waged war on the world. But behind every individual, behind every atrocity, lies an infrastructure that sustained it. That infrastructure was far more than just the Nazi Party. It was a web of connections, a network of power that spanned across nations, corporations, and institutions, many of which would continue to thrive long after the war's end. I walk through the streets of Berlin, a city still scarred by its past, its skyline dotted with the skeletons of buildings that once embodied the power of a regime that believed it could reshape the world. And yet, in this new world that has risen from the ashes, the same forces that fueled the rise of the Nazis have reappeared, disguised, rebranded, but undeniably present. The networks of collaboration, the money that funded the war machine, the corporations that profited from the suffering, they are still here. They were never fully dismantled. They never truly went away. One of the most chilling legacies of the Nazi regime is the way it infiltrated every aspect of society. From the corporate giants that supported the war effort to the scientists who experimented on human lives, the influence of the Third Reich did not vanish with the fall of Berlin. Instead, it quietly bled into the post-war world, where it continued to operate in the shadows. Those who had been involved in the atrocities, who had once held positions of unimaginable power, found new places to hide. They did not disappear. They simply adapted, reinvented themselves in the context of a world that was all too eager to forget. The Cold War offered the perfect environment for these men to thrive once again. As the world was divided into East and West, the former enemies found themselves bound by a new common cause, fear of the Soviet Union. And so, former Nazis, scientists, engineers, and officials were quietly absorbed into the growing intelligence apparatuses of the United States and the Soviet Union. The most infamous example, of course, is Operation Paperclip, the covert operation that brought hundreds of Nazi scientists to the United States, where they were given new identities, new jobs, and the opportunity to continue their work. These men, who had once been complicit in the horrors of the war, were now hailed as heroes, their pasts erased, their crimes ignored in favor of their expertise. But it wasn't just the Americans who sought to capitalize on the knowledge of the Third Reich. In the Soviet Union, too, former Nazis were brought in, their expertise put to work in secretive laboratories where the same mindsets that had led to the atrocities of the war were allowed to flourish once again. The Cold War, with its global struggle for dominance, became the perfect cover for the resurgence of these dark figures from the past. They were not simply forgiven, they were embraced, their actions justified in the name of geopolitical strategy. I think of the men who had once stood trial in Nuremberg, the ones whose names were etched in history as symbols of evil. But now, as I uncover more, I realize that their fates were not the end of the story. No, they were merely the beginning. The true consequences of the Nazi regime would not be fully felt until much later, when the world began to realize the full extent of the corruption, the collusion, and the moral compromises that had allowed such horrors to unfold in the first place. As I dig deeper, I begin to see the scale of the deception, the lengths to which those in power were willing to go to ensure that the legacy of the Nazis would continue to shape the future. It's not just about the scientists or the diplomats. It's about the corporations, the financial institutions, the business elites who continued to profit from the war, who continued to benefit from the exploitation of millions. Their names were never brought up in Nuremberg. Their role in the creation of the war machine, in the perpetuation of genocide, was conveniently forgotten. And so, as I stand here, at the crossroads of history, I realize that the reckoning that Nuremberg promised has never truly come. The trial may have brought justice to the men in the dock, but the systems that enabled them, the networks that fueled the war machine, remain in place. They may have been hidden, rebranded, and forgotten by the world, but they are still here, still shaping the course of history, still pulling the strings of power. The true aftermath of Nuremberg is not one of justice, but of complicity. The world has tried to move on, to forget, but the shadow of the Nazis continues to loom large. The consequences of their crimes did not end with their deaths or imprisonment. They continue to ripple through the decades, infecting the very systems that were meant to stop them. And as I look toward the future, I cannot help but wonder what other dark secrets remain buried in the vaults of history. What other truths are we too afraid to uncover? The world may have closed the door on Nuremberg, but the real reckoning, the one that we must all face, has only just begun. To be continued. The years drift by, and the shadow of the past grows longer. The world, having sought solace in the idea that justice had been served at Nuremberg, has allowed itself to believe that the darkest chapter in history had been closed. But as time unfolds, I realize the truth that those in power have failed to confront, that the ghosts of Nuremberg are not confined to the past. They are here, still among us, their whispers threading through the corridors of power, reminding us of the unfinished reckoning that continues to shape our world. I take you now into the quiet aftermath of the trials, when the focus of history shifts away from the men who stood trial and turns toward the institutions that allowed their rise. It is here, in the ashes of the old world, that the true legacy of the Nazi regime begins to take root. The trial may have judged the criminals, but the systems they built, those networks of power, corruption, and complicity, did not disappear. Instead, they evolved, hidden from view, quietly shaping the future. I stand now in the heart of post-war Europe, where the scars of war are still fresh on the land, and yet, beneath the rubble, something darker is taking form. The remnants of the Nazi regime, the bureaucrats, the corporate magnates, the ideologues, have not been entirely eradicated. Their influence remains, like a sickness that has spread beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I hear the stories whispered in hushed tones among the survivors, the ones who lived through the nightmare and who now find themselves trapped in a world that is still haunted by its own past. They speak of those who escaped, who vanished into the shadows of South America, the Middle East, and beyond. Some were hunted down, their crimes exposed to the light. Others, more fortunate, lived out their days in the anonymity of new identities, their pasts erased, their crimes forgotten. These men may have been hidden, but they were never truly gone. They walked among us, slipping into the post-war world, their influence reaching into the far corners of society. I think now of the hidden Nazis, those who never appeared at Nuremberg, the ones whose names were omitted from the record, whose roles in the machinery of death were conveniently overlooked. These men, as much as the leaders who stood trial, were integral to the operation of the Third Reich. They were the ones who ran the factories, who funded the war machine, who kept the trains running to the death camps, and they are the ones who, despite their crimes, were allowed to slip through the cracks, their stories buried beneath the weight of the larger narrative. I take you into the world of the post-war elites, those who were more than willing to forget. The men who had profited from the war, who had built their fortunes on the suffering of millions, continued to thrive. The companies that had supplied the Nazis, that had built the weapons, that had enslaved laborers, were allowed to rebuild, to reintegrate into the fabric of the global economy. They were forgiven, their role in the war swept under the rug, all in the name of progress and rebuilding. The industries that had once been the backbone of the Nazi war effort were now the engines of the post-war economy, their leaders rehabilitated, their ties to the past forgotten. The corporations that had fueled the Nazi regime did not wither and die with the fall of Berlin. They adapted, morphing into new entities that flourished in the years following the war. They became the titans of the Cold War economy, supplying both East and West with the weapons of a new conflict. The same companies that had helped Hitler's war machine were now supplying the world with the tools of the next great struggle. And in the corridors of power, the same men who had once collaborated with the Nazis now found themselves sitting at the tables of world diplomacy, their pasts erased, their hands unclean in the eyes of those who chose not to see. I cannot help but feel the pull of something more unsettling as I explore this new world, one where the past is buried beneath layers of history and the future marches forward, unburdened by the weight of the past. The truth of Nuremberg, the truths we chose not to see, are buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be faced. But the cost of that truth is high, and the world, it seems, is not ready to pay the price. I hear the faint echoes of a question that refuses to die. What if the Nazis never really lost? What if, despite their defeat on the battlefield, their ideology, twisted, corrupted, but not destroyed, continued to thrive, infecting the very systems that were meant to defeat them? The world has moved on, but the networks they left behind, the ideologies they planted, continue to shape the course of history in ways that remain largely unexamined. I walk the streets of the cities that once fell under Nazi control, the places where the battle for the future of Europe was fought. The scars are still there, buried beneath the surfaces of reconstruction, but beneath the shiny facades of progress, I see the quiet continuation of old systems. They have been reshaped, rebranded, but they are still there, operating in the shadows, dictating the terms of the new world order. The forces that allowed Hitler to rise to power have not been fully eradicated. They have simply adapted, learning from the mistakes of the past, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And as I stand here, amidst the ruins of the old world and the gleaming hopes of the new, I realize the terrifying truth. The story of Nuremberg, the story of justice and accountability, is far from over. It is a story that will continue to unfold in the years to come as the ghosts of the past continue to haunt us, reminding us of the unfinished work that lies ahead. The real reckoning is still to come, and the next chapter of this story will reveal a truth so dark it threatens to consume us all. As the years continue to unfold, the past of Nuremberg, like a dark specter, refuses to be buried. The trial may have drawn its conclusions, the judgment may have been passed, but the shadows it cast stretch far beyond the confines of that courtroom. I find myself drawn further into the labyrinth of history, where each new turn reveals a layer of truth, one that had been carefully concealed, meticulously forgotten, or intentionally erased. The story, it seems, is not over, not by a long shot. I stand now at a crossroads, in the final chapter of this journey. The echoes of the trial, of the horrors and the triumphs, are still fresh in my mind. Nuremberg was a trial of individuals, a trial of the obvious perpetrators, but what it failed to capture, what it could never capture, was the true, insidious legacy of the Nazi regime. The trial offered us a glimpse of justice, but the larger reckoning has yet to unfold. The forces that empowered the Nazi machine, those that were complicit in the evil, those who facilitated the war machine, those who profited from the suffering, are still out there, their influence still active, still shaping the course of history. The world may have thought it had seen the last of the Nazis, but history, as we know, has a tendency to repeat itself. The systems of power that gave rise to such horrors in the first place were never fully dismantled. Instead, they re-emerged, mutated, adapted to a new world order, but still deeply rooted in the old ways. The Cold War, with its ideological struggle between East and West, provided the perfect environment for the remnants of the Nazi network to thrive once again. These men and their ideologies may have been defeated in battle, but the war for the soul of Europe and the world was far from over. As I stand here, looking at the remnants of a world rebuilt from the ashes of the war, I am struck by the haunting realization that the true reckoning is not about what happened during the war, but about what happened after. The real question is not whether we defeated the Nazis, but whether we defeated their ideology, their machinery of hate, their systems of power that are still embedded in the global landscape today. I take you now into the modern world, where the legacy of Nuremberg still lingers, but in ways far more insidious than we might care to admit. It is easy to look back and point fingers at those who were brought to trial, to celebrate the justice of their convictions. But what about the systems they left behind? What about the ideologies that were never fully eradicated, that were allowed to spread into the fabric of the post-war world? What of the hidden networks that continued to shape the course of history, influencing politics, economics, and culture in ways that remain largely unseen? I hear the whispers again, the quiet, uncomfortable truths that refuse to die. The companies that once profited from the Nazi regime, the institutions that helped fund the war machine, the hidden collaborators who were never held accountable, all of these forces are still with us. They may have been forgotten in the public eye, but behind closed doors, they have continued to operate, quietly shaping the world from the shadows. The dark secrets buried at Nuremberg are not buried in the past. They are alive, thriving, and continuing to affect us today. The question that haunts me is simple yet chilling. How much of the world we live in today has been shaped by the very systems that created the Nazi regime? How many of the policies we take for granted, how many of the structures of power that dominate our lives are the direct descendants of the forces unleashed during the rise of the Third Reich? The truth is far more uncomfortable than we want to admit. I step back from the trial, from the judgment, and look at the world around me. The cold reality is that the reckoning has not yet been achieved. The men who stood trial in Nuremberg were not the only ones guilty of what happened during the war. Their guilt was symbolic, a stand-in for the collective responsibility that the world has yet to fully embrace. The ideology, the machinery, and the networks that made Nazi Germany possible are still present, and they have only been hidden beneath the surface of the post-war order. In the end, the legacy of Nuremberg is not just about what was accomplished in that courtroom. It is about what was left undone. It is about the uncomfortable truth that despite the trial's efforts, the war for justice has not yet been won. The ideological and institutional forces that gave rise to the horrors of the past are still with us, still shaping our world in ways we cannot yet fully comprehend. And as I stand on the precipice of history, I am left with a final thought. The past may be behind us, but its shadows stretch long into the future. The reckoning of Nuremberg was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning. We have yet to truly confront the dark secrets buried at Nuremberg, and the cost of that failure may be far greater than we ever imagined. The story is not over. It is only just beginning.